Okay, so today we're with Dr. Dwight Peterson, who I love calling Dr.
Ooh.
Dwight Peterson, because we've known each other for a very long time, much longer than either of us were officially much of anything. In fact, Dwight was my Sunday school teacher when I was 6 years old at Calvary Baptist Church in Grand Rapids, Michigan, when he
Now, was that
had the
at Ottawa
misfortune.
Hill High School?
I believe so. That was at Otto Hills High School before there was a
Yeah, okay,
building on 28th Street. So we go
that's
back a
right.
long ways. That's over 40 years. I won't
That's
date us too
crazy.
much, but
That's
we've had the
crazy.
opportunity to connect as in our professional lives with a personal history from a family perspective, ministry perspective, and just do life and do ministry and work together over all these years. So this is a special conversation for me, anyways, because it's kind of fun to connect all of those dots. Because ministry is not just a platform. It's not work. It's not an organization. It's people and relationships and family. So, Dwight, welcome to or Dr. Dwight, welcome to
Thank
the
you. Thank
podcast.
you.
Thanks for making some
Good to
time
be
for us.
here.
So I want to, I've obviously known you most of my life. And there are a lot of people out here that probably listen to this that will have some history with you, but may not know all of your story. So if you could just kind of outline where you come from, how you got into, let's say, the beginning point of ministry in bullet points, locate us there.
I was born and raised in a great Christian home. Really wonderful, godly parents, really loved the Lord. My dad, in the early years of my life, was a businessman, and we lived in Cincinnati, Ohio. Long time. In fact, I realized the other day, nobody in the planet is a longer Bengals fan than me, because I started as a Bengals fan when they became a franchise. So everybody who's a fan has to be at least as long as me, but can't be longer. My dad was a businessman. We lived a great life in a suburb of Cincinnati. The summer between my sixth grade year and my seventh grade year, my dad made a decision to leave business to go work for a ministry called Word of Life. He worked in the business area and helped in the adult camp area. And that transition was of great sacrifice to my folks. My dad sold a home that we'd only lived in for 10 months. He took a 90% pay cut. My parents did. And right after, in fact, days after my dad made the decision to do all that, my youngest brother was contracted with leukemia. So it was quite a transition for us. So I grew up around ministry people. I grew up around ministry. I had one of the privileges of growing up in ministry. My dad loved what he did. What my dad did was fun for us. I went to camps and did all kinds of ministry. Working at camps, I had people that were invested in me that worked in that. And it was almost like ministry was just a way of life for us, not something we did. It was what our life was. And early in my life, I was considering the occupations of the guys who had an influence in my life. For instance, I worked at in the camps, in the kitchen a lot. And I so even considered culinary school for a while. But in my junior year, I was supposed to work as a first cook at a camp. And some of the men that led and directed some of the camps began to talk about some needs. And my name came up as someone that they thought had ministry potential. So that summer, the summer before my senior year, instead of being in the kitchen, I was on the program staff. And that began to move me to think about vocational type ministry. I fell in love with what it was. Um, while I grew up in a great Christian home, ministry families around me caused me to think about ways I could do ministry stuff without being in vocational ministry. So I decided I was going to graduate from high school. I was going to go to college, play basketball. I would major in math, minor in phys ed, become a high school basketball coach, win a couple of state championships, and be the next John Wooden was my plan. And figured that would be a great way to do ministry. I could work with kids to, do all the same stuff without all what I considered to be some of the negatives about vocational ministry. Graduated, decided to go to a 1-year Bible Institute, sort of in the early days. It would have been sort of a gap year program before I headed off to college. And I went to lunch with a pastor who was a good friend of the family's, a man by the name of John White. He took me out to lunch, and I don't think he was pressing me because of something he didn't think I knew or thought. I think he just randomly was curious and said to me, I see you as having ministry gifts. I'm curious why you're not pursuing vocational ministry. And I'd actually thought about it, actually had 3 reasons. I gave him the 3 reasons, none of which applied to him personally. And he said something to me that really changed my life. He said, have you ever considered that it may not be that way for you either? And I hadn't. And I prayed hard. And my mind was, if I do this, 1, the girl I loved and wanted to marry, I knew would break up with me. And 2, if I was in the pastoral ministry, I'd never coach. I ended up deciding to do that. And the girl did break up with me, but I tell that story often. The short version is now 43 years whatever, 46 years later. I've been married to that girl now for 43 years and coached basketball as part of ministry for probably 38 years or something like that. And I wonder sometimes how God looks at us when we're just, weeping, crying, saying, I just don't want to do this. And it's what he has planned all along. So that decision, though, triggered some significant events. One is he said to me a couple months later, the first encounter, he said, just pray about it. I'm going to be with you again in January. In January, I told him that I wanted to go to vocational ministry route. He provided me and said, hey, we've talked as a staff. We were sort of anticipating you would do that. And invited me to come to Grand Rapids, go to Grand Rapids Baptist College, and be discipled there and learn ministry from that place. I say to people often that apart from my salvation, the 2 most important decisions I made in my life was to marry Bonnie, and secondly, to go to Grand Rapids, Michigan. It literally changed the trajectory of my life. It determined how I viewed ministry. Everything that's been true of my life flows out of those 2 decisions. I went to Grand Rapids. I had a variety of positions over the years there. Somewhere in my junior, senior year of college, the church called a new youth pastor. His name was Dennis Wilhite, who you know quite well.
Quite well.
And that relationship, I've said often that apart from my dad, there's nobody who has shaped how I think, what I do, so much of my life more than he did. And Dennis and I formed ultimately a very close relationship. And he and I began to talk and think. I knew that the time was coming where I was going to have to leave and go on my own. So we began to talk about how we could take what we were learning and discussing and make it transferable to other people. So we started to create training stuff, and really over the next, I don't know how many years, 40 plus years, we've continued to do that. I found myself in youth ministry at two churches over a 20-year period. Bonnie and I eventually made the decision to leave a church we loved, ministry we loved. My dream was to be a youth pastor, ultimately in a small town, and live there for 100 years. That was my experience. That's what I wanted. But I eventually made a decision to go work at a university. And that was an interesting time for me because I was now doing ministry in that context, trying to still develop ministry, still working with ministries. Did that for 20 years. Coached while I was in Indiana, coached while I was at the university. That gave me another context. Actually spent some years, the last 3 years I was at that university, I coached at Scranton University on a basketball team. So I had a context that wasn't a Christian sort of world. And in about the year 16 or 17, Bonnie and I, one of my children, became involved in a church planting network that was committed to plant churches that loved and sought to reach and incorporate into the church university students. My son had gotten in contact with them, ended up getting 3 years of training, and he was being sent to Columbus, Ohio to plant a church with a target of Ohio State students, and called me during COVID and said, "Hey, how would you and Mom feel about leaving the university and coming with us?" And Bonnie and I think it took us about 10 seconds. We'd actually been praying, hadn't told anybody. We loved what we were seeing in that ministry and just really felt like it fit everything for me. Like I had spent years in youth ministry. I'd spent years at the university, and now I had an opportunity to work in a church and really take all the things that I've learned my whole life and sort of help build a church with a lot of those principles and philosophies. So now I'm in Columbus, Ohio. I tell people I have a boss who's 31 and he's my son. He's actually the second oldest person on the staff after me. But it has been an unbelievable learning experience for me. It's not at all just an experience where I'm sort of the teacher and the sage and the leader. I'm learning a lot and been asked to make some changes in the way I do things that I'm convinced has actually made me better, and really feel like God, it took 40 years to train me, to grow me, to mature me. The statement my wife and I make a lot is that God had this in mind all along. So here we are and loving what we're doing.
So, and that gives us a great backbone. I wish we had about 12 hours to dig into all the corners of that, because there's so much. I mean, having had a ringside seat to much of that journey, and in the conversations we've had over the years about even, you and I, having me calling you saying, what do I do about whatever? Because you've been there before, as a dad, as a leader, as a ministry professional, et cetera, across all the platforms. There's so much to dig into. But the first place I want to locate is in this conversation is the transition from frontline church ministry. Like you said, you were in two different youth ministries, one in New Jersey, and then First Baptist Elkhart, where you spent a lot of time and really took that foundation from growing up in the Word of Life ecosystem, building that foundation academically, and then following that inquiry from John White, who also had a big impact on my life. He was my pastor for most of my formative years, but that transition from church ministry and frontline to the college environment. Talk a little bit about what that was for you personally, some of the dynamics, that adjustment, and then also how ministry changed and stayed the same between those two contexts.
From a ministry perspective, it was not so much any different what I do. In fact, we've got a guy who's recently come to our church who's been in the marketplace in very, very significant business, Fortune 500 type companies, doing leadership development. And he and I have spent a lot of time together talking about that, what it looks like in the marketplace, what it looks like in a ministry context. But he said something to me really interesting. He said, often when I ask people what they do, they describe their job to me. And he said to him, the job is how I do what it is I do. For me, I learned quickly that there's a certain thing I do and I accomplish. In fact, when I was coaching at the University of Scranton, I had a really interesting experience. I had coached there a year. We were doing the following summer basketball camp, and the coach came up to me and said, "Hey, have you met Ryan? He's going to be a new player this fall." And I said, "No, he's in the other gym. I've been in that gym." And he said, "Well, I need you to do what it is you do with him," which I thought was such a fascinating way to reinforce this is what I do. What happens is the way that happens in a church context is very different than a university context. For instance, it was much easier for me to build authentic relationships from which I could do ministry in a church context because I had a lot of opportunities for contact with that. That's one of the things I loved about youth ministry is unlike a lot of ministries in a local church, a youth pastor is spending a lot of time in a variety of contexts with the people he's ministering to. In fact, I've often said if churches were run more like youth groups, they'd be more effective. But often an adult ministry pastor, for example, can build a structure where he's not spending much time with people. So, I'm in van rides with them. I'm on canoe trips with them. I'm coaching basketball with them. I just had all of that. And then I got to the ministry, the church, the university context, and these kids walk into my class for 45 minutes and then they're gone, and they're in my classroom for 3 times or 2 times a week, and I didn't know how to do that. I had to figure out how it is that I can create ways to have more contact with these students and build relationships so that I could do what it is I did. In a church context, I had a team of people. We're all kind of working together, and those people were investing in my life. It felt very much like a team. The university context can be very island-like, very individualistic. You don't sit in a room and mention a student and everybody collaborate to figure out what they're going to do. So I also had to figure out how to build teamwork, how to build networks. There wasn't any expectation or formal way for me. For instance, I got a student, he's in other classes. Are they seeing things? Do they have a different read? He's on another sports team. How do I do that? So it took me some time to figure out how to do all that in those contexts. And in athletics, like right now, I'm coaching basketball again in a public school here in Columbus. I'm a volunteer assistant. But again, what I'm doing is the same. I'm just doing it in a context where it's not in their minds about discipleship, but I'm still trying to be a very good coach. I'm still trying to help those people be successful. I'm still trying to do what it is I do and ultimately arrive at the same level of relationships and the same goals for them in their lives. But how I did things, how I accessed it, the ease to create. For instance, in the university, I started volunteering to do like backpacking trips over spring break, or 4 credit wilderness trips, build a relationship with the phys ed team so they see me as an ally. That sounds like manipulation. I mean, really, I really was, so that I could, kids maybe could go on a trip and get PE credit. In fact, by the time I left, I think I was teaching classes in almost every discipline at the university, and just found that was the same thing when I moved here. I didn't really, my first year, I didn't really know where or how to do what I did. It was the first time here where I had no relational capital. For instance, I was asked to kind of oversee Sunday morning, and we're a church plant. So, the van pulls up, and I realized I might walk over to a group of guys and say, hey, let's move the tent over here. And they don't know me from Adam, and they're trying to figure out why this old guy wants the tent some other place. And once again, I had to figure out how to build relationships, how to connect, and my son, who's the lead pastor, he and I kept having conversations about how I'm feeling about what I'm doing, him looking. And it probably took us a year and a half to 2 years to really figure out how to position me and how to build ways for me to do what it is I do here.
Yep.
And the last 6 months to 8 months has been really good, but I had to be patient to not only figure out myself, but let other people who are in my world to figure me out and how to position me. And I really think, honestly, it took all those years in other places to humble me enough, to grow me enough, to be patient, to be open, to be willing, and to be able to accomplish what needed to be accomplished to set all that up.
So I want to pull a string, because that's the thesis of what I do is not necessarily defined by the platform I'm in. I mean, you, ever since I've known you, you take the role of coach, pastor, professor, whatever. Those are all roles and platforms. And the thing they have in common is you in space with other people with maybe a position or a inflection point of influence. But the platform is ostensibly there from the outside for a purpose that is not necessarily the same as discipleship.
Mm-hmm.
But all of what you just described is across these different platforms, shepherding people, asking that
Right.
question, what's God doing? What's his agenda? How do I step in? How do I build relationships for the purpose of having a spiritual impact, helping them grow and multiply? Going back to the college context, because I mean, in the education realm, we live, you and I, even in this context, live under the education umbrella, but in the front line in that collision point. At no point in that part of your explanation did you say, and I taught classes that had this specific intended outcome. You were across, by the time you got done, to your point, you were involved in classes across all these different disciplines, started in youth ministry as the departmental focus, and moved out from there. In that context on campus, where did you see the purpose, the collision points of purpose between the instructing function, the professor function, and that discipleship function? And what fired really well? What was challenging? Expand on that a little bit, because I think most people from the outside don't necessarily, they think, okay, a student walks into class, gets content, does class, gets grade, moves towards degree. That's kind of the big picture. That's not necessarily how it all flows.
Well, here's something that came to my mind that I've just been thinking about recently, because I'm aging and I've watched as people age, it becomes difficult to do ministry. And part of what I began to realize is that it can be really easy in certain contexts to start with a role and try to build relationships with people out of that role versus building relationships with people, and from that relationship, a role begins to emerge that you're playing in their life. So I walk into the high school I'm coaching at now, and as I build a relationship with those guys and students, a role begins to emerge. I begin to learn things about them. I begin to offer help and suggestions, but it started at a relational base. So I've kind of first always looked at, though I wouldn't have ever defined it objectively the way I just did, but student comes into my office and I saw what I did as just a means to be able to build a relationship and give me access to who they are and what they are and what's going on in their world. So I'm reading papers, and I'm not just reading it to figure out if they've fulfilled the objectives and what grade, but what am I learning about the student? What's going on in their world? So I might, at a class, call a student up and say, hey, you mentioned this. Can I help you? You want to go to lunch sometime? Whatever. Just finding ways to generate conversations. And ultimately, what ended up happening to me at the university was I would have probably 10 or more to 15 students a week stopping in my office to talk. And the vast majority of those had nothing to do with academics. But academics gave me access to them. The classroom gave me access to them. Coaching, I would put it the same way. So like people might ask me, what's your goal as a coach? And I say, I want to be the best basketball coach I can. I want those kids that head coach, for instance, to think we're a better basketball team. I'm a better coach because Dwight is here, so that when I have these conversations with them and they're interacting with me and spiritual things come up, for example, they believe that I'm doing that because I love them, not that I became a coach and I'm really not that good. So I'm just did it so I could have spiritual conversations with them. I remember in the early days when I was in the local church, we had a Christian school and we were trying to bring a discipleship mentality. And we got in these debates as, are you a discipler or are you an educator? And to some people, they felt like if I'm a math teacher, I'm an educator, and you want to add discipleship into the equation. And like if we decide on discipleship, then it doesn't matter whether I'm a good math teacher. Well, my point is that if you're trying to disciple this kid and you're a math teacher, you better be the best math teacher in the world, so that they see you and respect you for what's happening, so that then you have a platform to be able to do it. It reminds me, I was influenced by John Wooden when I first started coaching and when I was playing. And he talked about not the scoreboard didn't determine our success. And when I was coaching in the Christian environment, I talked about that, and people thought, well, that means, the expectation's lowered. And I'm no, it doesn't mean it's lowered. It means it's actually raised. So I see all these things I'm doing as just a means to be able to to have the right, the privilege, the opportunity to gain access to the lives of people, so that I can do that. We talk often in Anchor, that you can run an organization, for instance. This is what I talk about with my friend who's in the marketplace. And he loved the statement when I said to him, I said, you can have, for me, it would be growing people. He might say flourishing or developing, whatever the word is in the marketplace. You can have productive people, but they're not growing. They're not, becoming better people and all that kind of stuff. But my opinion is, but you can't have growing, developing people that aren't productive people. So it's not having to choose between the two. It's deciding that I can be highly effective at something, but not really. Discipleship for me is defined by helping somebody become more and more like Jesus. So at when I'm coaching in a public school context, I'm still trying to be a great coach. And it doesn't mean that I have a choice. It just means the more I'm better at the craft, the more I'm helping them, the more I'm gaining, the privilege and the right that when I have conversations, I can do that. In fact, the coach has an event where he has people come in and present their story, and he asked me to do that. And I introduced it by just saying, here's some things that influenced my view of athletics. And one of those was my faith. And then I gave quotes about life from a lot of different people, like a John Wooden. One of the quotes I gave at the end, John Wooden said, the reason people fail instead of succeed is they sacrifice what they want most for what they want at the moment. So I gave secular quotes like that. But then I said to them, I mentioned my faith, so I can't end without something that Jesus said. And Jesus said, be very careful where you put your treasure. And he said, for two reasons. Number one is you can lose it. And number two, that treasure will consume you. And what I said to those guys is, that doesn't mean that if you're a basketball player, you're still working hard, but it doesn't mean your identity. It's not all those things. So I think it's here's what I do, and how does this, whatever it is I'm doing, teaching, coaching. I had a guy in my church who worked at a grocery store, and he would hire high school kids. And in the context of helping them become good with produce and good with all of those things, he was building a context to have conversations with them about other things.
Yeah. And that, that actually, that's a good summary or a good snippet of, years ago, you mentioned, you and my dad started putting together materials, and that grew into curriculum, that grew into really the foundations of everything that we're doing now. I mean, the seeds are decades and decades of iterations, but they really come down to that essence of saying, okay, what is God doing, and how do we, from a leadership perspective, whether it's in the local church, whether it's in business, whether it's in a classroom, a traditional classroom, whether it's in some other frontline environment, whatever role or position I have in that space, how do I create an ecosystem that not only gives room for, but leans into stewarding what God's doing in the lives of people? And one of the things that has been crystallizing for me, and how do we communicate this? Because I think it's challenging when, for us anyways, in the education field, you put on the website, here's the course, here's the degree plan, here's the piece of paper at the end, here's what it looks like from an accreditation standpoint, transfers, yada, 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 all of the things that people are familiar with. But to take that extra step and say, okay, ultimately, all of this is a ecosystem that is intentionally designed to understand the purpose, pathway, and potential of an individual life and a collection of lives in ministry, et cetera, and to steward that as a fiduciary, if you use the economic term. We as ministry leaders, educators, whatever, are ultimately responsible for stepping into that and saying, how do we steward these moments, these collision points really well? And really, when we set up the learning blueprint that we use for all of our courses with 11.6 Anchor, et cetera, in frontline environments, that's the easiest way to boil down, is we created room for and structure for those collision points between content, context, and coaching, are the 3 C's that we use, which is, as instructors, ministry leaders, the coaching is stepping into that and stewarding and stirring that for those purposes. You've lived in frontline world from an academic standpoint, classroom, building relationships on campus, et cetera. You've lived in frontline environment as a pastor, disciple maker, et cetera. You've also, at this point, one of the key things that you're doing in our ecosystem is you're one of our, you're probably our longest standing prof on the grad and undergrad level. I think you've got more hours on target.
That's the nice thing about gray hair. I'm hearing those kinds of things more and more in my life.
So I'm curious if you could if you could articulate from your perspective, because you're working with freshmen in college that are involved in certain environments, you're working with graduate students that are down the road and have been humming on, with a high operating cycle. That approach or process to the prof role, what does it afford you, and what are some things that you've seen as from a fruit perspective in that disciple making, that core function?
I think when I first went to the university, I actually said in a lot of my classes, when I was a youth pastor, I used to say a lot, it would be really helpful for you if you would do these things. And I could try to create some arbitrary, okay, you can't go on this trip unless you do your devotion so many times, or all that kind of stuff. But I would say in the classroom when I was at the college, Christian college I was at, and I would say, now that I'm in this context, I can build it so that there is motivation. I can make you do it. I can't make you get anything out of it. So I would structure in all my classes, things like regular devotions and prayer and all those life skills. Now, some people might say to me arbitrarily, but that's true of everything. If I was going to teach weightlifting, am I going to make the kids lift weights? Of course I'm going to. I remember doing that when I introduced in our Christian school that we're going to make kids read the Bible every day, for instance, and I got this backlash. And I remember saying to some staff and parents, if I was a Spanish teacher and I made a kid read Spanish every day, what would you call me? You'd call me a great teacher. If I was teaching math and I made the kids do math problems every day, you'd call me a great teacher. Well, that's all I'm doing. I'm teaching a subject, and if the Bible becomes important to that, then I'm doing that. And I'm also trying to build in that life skills. Here's what can happen in the university, for example. We have them read books, but the goal becomes of the assignment is to be able to recite the content of the book. So like I would give people a book report and they're writing it, and all they're thinking is, how do I get say something from early, middle, and end of the book so I can convince? And tests are all about whether I have retention, whether I can remember, whether I can articulate it. But then the guy leaves college and he's struggling with his marriage. So he and his wife buy a book on marriage and they're going to read it. Well, what have they been trained to do? They're not going to turn a paper in at the end of the time, 2 months. They're going to do it. And even sometimes in Bible studies that people can have, it can become just like it was in college, where all we're doing is talking about the learning. So the goal, I know I've been successful in learning in some university contexts when I can recite the material. And I would say to my students, that's not how we're going to do book reports. I want you to learn to read this book with a mindset of what is there in this book that's going to be helpful to me, which is a life skill. And for me, even from an academic standpoint, again, even if you're doing a math, and let's say I'm in education, I'm teaching a guy to be a math teacher, it's not about can he pass the test, but can he understand it in a context to use it? Well, I can't use what I understand. So I would sometimes get in these discussions about that, are we academic or application? Like somehow when you focus on application, you're not intellectual. Well, I have to understand, for instance, basketball. I can't be a good coach if I don't understand basketball. Like I was at practice yesterday and I'm working with the bigs, and I said to one of the guys, I said, listen, here's what you need to do. When you're inside, take this arm and I want you to focus on this opposite arm, hitting the guy that's guarding you right in his tricep. Hit that tricep and then shoot the ball. Well, one of the coaches came over to me afterwards and said, I was a big, I played Division I college. I've never heard that in my life. Okay, well, I didn't, it's not a test I'm taking. I'm acquiring information to be able to accomplish something. So I remember when I was in a university, I got accused as not being an intellectual, and I went to the high-end intellectual profs at the college and said, "What does that mean?" He smiled and said, "It means you're having them read books that they understand, and you're having them take tests that they understand." And what I find so often is when we try to move people away from that, it can seem sort of difficult because they're not thinking in terms of application. I've actually felt guilty because I went to high school in New York, and we had this program called BOCES. And for me, it seemed like the kids who weren't very smart went to BOCES, and that's where they learn how to work on cars and cosmetology and all that kind of stuff. Now I got to a point looking at it and I'm like, those people understood education because they knew that the goal was to, when they got done, fix a car. But we can give information, even as it relates to the Bible, without any kind of what's the outcome of this. And the more I can structure assignments that help them discover themselves, their abilities, their reading it. So like I started doing what I tried to use book report and reframe them, but that was impossible. So I just said, we're not doing book reports. We're doing benefits paper. So you're going to give to me 3 benefits from the book, 3 things that for you really made this work, and then 3 ways that you can apply it. But again, in doing so, that goes back to what I'm doing. I'm learning from them, their context, their skills, so that I can help them also learn to do ministry around their gift mix, not trying to do ministry around something else.
It's interesting
and again, I find I have far more intellectual conversations about, the meaning of things or, philosophies or whatever. But it's not, the goal is not that.
Yeah, it's interesting because from where I sit in the ecosystem of trying to shepherd this process organizationally, and then even in degree, course design, all of that fun stuff, the tension that I regularly have to navigate, I think that we all have to navigate on some level, is this concept of rigor. To your point, academic rigor. And traditionally, academic rigor has been defined in the space of how much content that is, how hard to engage and wrestle with. And I think there absolutely is value in volume and stretching capacity there. When I look at our ecosystem, to your point, what I think of as rigor is the process of having to do something with it that's meaningful, that can be tested in the real world, that will actually evidence outcomes, competency development, skill development, as opposed to content mastery. And when you do walk into the room of PhDs and traditional academics that have not been held accountable to how does this walk out of here into the real world, but they have been held accountable to this old concept of rigor, they're not quite sure what to do with that. There's a part of them that's intrigued often, but as a metric, we've moved the nexus point of rigor from volume of content to value of content and the outcomes that come from that. And that's really what we coach to.
And think about Jesus, because you mentioned my doctorate. What surprises people is my field of interest was skill development science. And I studied skill development science originally because I wanted to be a good coach. And the more I did it, the more I realized these concepts are all over the scriptures. And then I began to realize that we do in the church the same thing, where it's content dump, but it's not really about behavioral change or skill development. So I began to try to study what skill development science is revealing to us. And for instance, one of the things I often think about when I talk about this is I'll say to people, what did Jesus say in the Great Commission? And sometimes I'll say, did he not say, teach them everything I commanded you? And I always get a yes. And I said, no, that's not all what he said. He said, teach them to obey what I commanded. And every time I used to do this, now I say, now the minute I said that, I know what some of you thought, and you thought that I just de-emphasized what he said. But my point is that I can't do something if I don't know something. So I have to teach what Jesus said, but I'm doing it in a way that motivates and gives people the opportunity to do something. And, so we value success based on an ability, in a number on the skill. And we've all heard this in the marketplace. It's sort of like freshmen used to say to me in one of my classes, what piece of advice would you give us as we're starting? And I would say, understand you're here to get an education, not a degree. Mm. If you're here to get a degree, you'll sit in your room and all you'll do is study. And you won't see being on an athletic team or getting a job or building relationships or doing all these other things that are available, and you'll get a degree. Mm-hmm. I mean, we know that there are these people, for instance, in the area I work at, that got a doctorate in organizational leadership that don't understand leadership.
Right. And I would say the degree, when I'm talking to students and even parents, I'm like, the degree is kind of like the t-shirt at the end of the race, right? And it's really, really clear once you stand around for a minute in that t-shirt, whether you fill it out or you don't. And that is a more important value point than which t-shirt even you're putting on. What brand is on that t-shirt and what nomenclature is there.
And here's an example. I just want to emphasize it doesn't diminish academics. It doesn't diminish, as you're talking about, rigor. And I find that when students make the transition, they feel like it takes them 3 times as long to write a book report in their first or second class here at Anchor than it does otherwise. But then after they get it, it's like, wow, I'm seeing this all over the place. And then they're doing this assignment. Like I had a student who was making a presentation to all of his bosses about something, and his his assignment was all about to help make that assignment productive. And I can tell you, he read the books and he could have easily passed any of the people's tests with the content, but he was excited to learn it. I went to a Bobby Knight when I was a young coach, and he spent 2.5 hours. I got 8 pages of notes in basketball. Some of you may not know this. It's called the down screen, not screening, the down screen. And I was listening to every word and hanging on everything he said. Why? To pass a test? No, because I was a coach that was going to go back, and I wanted to help these guys down screen. I wanted to do it effectively. And I think it actually engages everything that we say in all contexts, but it also puts pressure on us because we just can't think we're successful because people know something. And that's what Jesus said. He said, really I want them to be able to do this.
Yeah. And that really is the adjustment that we make in how the education process is set up, the framework is set up, adjusts the student's perspective, causes them to have to own and engage, creates a vacuum for that learning that pulls them into needing to not just know information, but also say, what is the implication of this and how does this work out in reality? Which I don't remember the statistics, but improves the stickiness of learning dramatically. But from the instructor standpoint, and this is one of the things that we have a lot of people that are kind of adjacent to our ecosystem that are like, hey, I'd love to be a prof at Anchor or in one of the 11-6, via Clark Summit or one of the other relationships. And what I struggle to communicate to somebody coming from what I call legacy education or even discipleship background that's information oriented is exactly that you have to, the responsibility to move into that coaching role in the dynamics of individual lives and shepherding is a big one. But I want to pivot here. I want to take about 10 more minutes. I know you've got a lot on your plate and I'm probably over time on your schedule, but I want to take 10 more minutes and I want to focus on... I
always have whatever time you need, Ben.
I'll edit that out so that you're
okay.
Anyway, I'm just kidding. anyways, but I want to talk a little bit, or I want to kind of pull a little bit from your transition to Capital Church and into the role that you're playing now, because it is not just from a context standpoint, but from a role standpoint, even a culture standpoint, was a pretty significant transition. And one of the things I know about you and have watched you over the years is that one of the things that makes you exceptional at what you do professionally and across all those platforms is that you are, by definition, a learner. You have applied yourself not to saying, I've learned this, I'm done, I will pass it along, but you continue to kind of press in. And that transition was for you a pretty significant adjustment across a lot of different platforms. When you made the decision, you and Bonnie, to transition away from Clark Summit University and to Capital Church, from Clark Summit, Northeast PA to Columbus, Ohio, that was a pretty significant adjustment. There was a lot of joy in that. But there's also a lot that you had to navigate in changing context. Talk a little bit about what the challenges were, where you had to learn and grow, and how that dynamic worked for you.
First, and I referenced this earlier, it was, I had no relational capital at all. None. And even any background I had wasn't in this context. So I could say, I taught at this college, nobody's ever heard of it. I ran this conference, nobody's ever heard of it. I could even mention people books I read, or people, nobody knows any of these people, and they don't know me. And, everybody's much younger than me. But it was also a context where there was a certain language, there were certain words that they used that I didn't use. And so, for example, I was immediately pressed into the preaching schedule, but there were language things. Like, for instance, I did this message, and at the end, I thought, man, I really had this zinger, because at the end, I'm like, and that's why David said this, and that's why Paul said this, and that's why Peter said this. And I had all these names that everybody knows about. And we have this process where every Monday, we evaluate all communication in our services, from announcements to what was said between songs to the message. And I get in there, and one of the things that was said to me was, hardly anybody in that room knows who those people are. So I had to learn a whole new language and way to do things, and how to, for instance, there's a certain motivation where I was for people that want to be like Jesus, but now I'm trying to motivate people to want to. What am I saying that's compelling to this guy who doesn't know Jesus that would make him want to? So, like, for instance, this Sunday I'm preaching, we're doing a series called the Controversial King on Jesus. And I'm doing foot washing. And what I'm going to talk about is how that what was so controversial about Jesus is his view of authority, and what authority did for you and what it gave you. Now, there could be a businessman there who's not even interested in Jesus, but he can walk away and say, I need to serve the people better. In fact, I sat in a meeting with, two guys in their 30s. I taught homiletics. I taught speech. I'm a speech communication major. And they're saying to me, listen, this has been slower coming than we like. Actually, the meeting started with them saying, we need to have a conversation with you, and we're afraid that you're going to think you need to resign. That's always a great way to start a conversation. But what they did was they pulled me off the preaching schedule.
And one of them was your 31-year-old
one of them was
son.
my, at that time, 30-year-old son.
Yeah.
And what he said to me, which I thought was very fascinating, he said, I think I've been unfair to you. And he said, Dad, I've never met anybody in my life that has more of a pastor's heart than you. And he said, but you don't know these people yet. You don't know their language. And so what I want you to do is be the guy that every message, when it's done, I want you to come up and say to the people, here's what I think you should have heard. Here's what I think you needed to do. And learning and being willing. I actually think I'm back on the preaching schedule, obviously, but now I think I'm way better preacher than I was before. And I don't think, in fact, eventually I said to them, I said, listen, I'm not trying to become bilingual. And what I meant by that was I'm not trying to learn how to, okay, when I go to chapel of a Christian university, I speak this way, but here at church, I was convinced that if I could understand what they were telling me and help me do that, I would be better at all those arenas. I think I'm a way better communicator. Helping people, finding, for instance, what I said, taking the patience to build relationships. Give you an example. We have a college ministry. I have a lot of experience with college ministry, but this network does training. So we have a guy in our church who's the college ministry pastor. One of the things I do really well is to help people say to me, okay, tell me what you do, tell me what you're trying to accomplish, and help them think through, are there ways they can do better? Now, if I would have started right in the beginning with him saying, I want you to walk me through, there's threat, there's, do you think I'm doing something wrong? But when I said to him, I want to take this next semester and I want to walk through everything that you do with the mindset that we're going to do three things. Number one of the things we'll say about that is that's great. We don't want to change anything. Another thing we might say is that what you're doing is great, but I think if we tweak it this way or that way, we can make it better. And one thing we might say, we're not going to do that anymore. Now, if I did that in week one, because I had the right to do it, he's not going to hear it. But he was like, oh man, I'd love that, because he trusts me. He knows me because I've invested in him. And I just had to, it was like starting all over and having zero credibility and zero platform and not demanding that people respond to me. For instance, my son, we do this thing called classroom sessions, which is we do a lot of the skill development training that we don't do in the morning service. We do it like for classes afterwards. And when he was introducing it, he said, my dad's going to do that. And I'm super excited because Dr. Dwight will be the teacher of classroom sessions. And everybody in the auditorium laughed. And afterwards, he said to me, why do you think people laughed? I said, because they thought you were kidding. Nobody has any idea here I'd got a doctorate. Because it's not strategically important. And it took me time to, be able to do that and work through that and understand how I could build relationships and push, to take the time to figure out and make sure I understood what my son was telling me. And I've said to people, I think it took 40 years to just get me to a place where I can be willing to do that. And like I said, I think it's just helped me. I think I'm better at everything that I do. And God's opened doors. Like I said, now I'm coaching at a high school, but that took 2 years before that opportunity developed. And God's opened up some doors for me to build relationships with guys in the golf team. And I got to baptize one of the guys in the golf team. And but it just was taking all that I know even and figure out, how do I put it in a context that's going to be helpful.
Yeah. And that's, we'll wrap it here. I'll a couple of observations quick and we'll wrap it here and we're going to have to come back and do another one of these, or 4 or 5, because we didn't get into really some of the skill development stuff, Foundations for Christian Living, Grow System, Wilderness Institute, all of these different manifestations and seasons.
Which again, that reminds me, what's so fascinating to me is the two groups of people that come up to us most and say to us, that was an amazing message, are the very young or not even saved, and those that have been around. And when you said Foundations of Christian Living, the thing I hear most and anchor from that is, I've been in the church for 40 years. How come I never heard this stuff? Yeah. How come nobody ever talked about it? And now I'm in an environment where we're talking like that right in the beginning. And my son just did a message on the 10 Commandments. And I was standing there with a a couple who, are in their late 50s, grew up in the church. And the wife said, never in my life have I ever heard anything what you just said on that. And we get that a lot when we start doing things the way we do them.
Yeah, and fundamentally over the years, we've run into so many conversations with ministry leaders that ask the question, how do I get the outcomes that that I'm seeing in this platform, this piece or whatever, whether it's the academic side, whether it's wilderness ministry, whether it's whatever, a weekend snow camp, or just even speaking, at XYZ place with an adult or couples ministry, et cetera. You get that, like, wait a minute, where did this come from? How do I get there? And there are two really main ways that I would answer that. One is, number one, it's not as hard as you think. The idea is simple, but number two, to your point, it takes time. This isn't a plug it in and set it and forget it. There's effort, there's relationship, and all of it's built off that. And that's how Jesus walked out what he laid the foundation for that we see in Scripture. So we'll kind of end with that.
We would have considered him up until the very end, if we read the Gospels, that he was, right at the very end there, the team he's going to leave to take this message to the world are fighting of who's the greatest. And yet he did the very thing you're talking about, build a system and structure from which over time, these were the things. It's sort of like we say at church is we want to build a system that if you check into the system, you're going to become like Jesus. And if you don't become like Jesus, it's because you haven't availed yourself to things that are available. And we're not talking, again, it's like you're saying, it's the way we do things, the point of it, how it's structured, all those kinds of things to get an outcome. And that's one of the things I'm realizing too, is the team will talk about, what this is going to look like in 30 years, 40 years. And I'm like, I'm not going to be around to ultimately see some of this. But we've been 3 years, and it's just amazing to me the outcomes we're finding already based on the way we continue to try to build systems and structures that are going to, in and of themselves, create this.
Yep. And people that are growing in those systems that can then leverage on those systems and multiply. There's not a single product that finishes and goes on the shelf and goes away. And it's
amazing when I'm teaching here, some of the things, like I had 2 morning meetings this morning, different meetings with the guy who's in charge of our experience team and the woman that's in charge of our children's ministry. And I'm walking through some of this discipleship stuff because we want them to have a discipleship mentality in what they're doing. And both of them at times went, oh, so that's why you have us do this, this, and this as a part of that. And I'm like, yeah. And that's why you have this requirement, or we do it at this time and in this order. Even things like, how do you have your devotions? We could say, okay, there's these 5 components. Doesn't make any difference the order in which you do things. And sure it does, depending upon what you're trying to get out of it. And that's been super fun, just super, super. I feel like I'm in this amazing, some people call sandbox, and I'm just having a ball with, being able to do it. It's only reinforced everything that I've thought and believed. And I'm more committed than I've ever been to the way we do things. It works. And it works because it's, I think, truer to the model that we find in the Scriptures and the model that Jesus demonstrated.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, thanks for taking the time. We'll schedule another one of these as soon as we can. Productively do that, and we'll dig into some of the other corners.
All right. Thank you, sir. Good to be with you again.
All right. Catch up with you soon.